Christians often preach that men and women are different but have equal dignity. And then the conversation only focuses on different gender roles. Recently I debated a very devout guy from my TLM parish who holds the opinion that women should not be allowed to pursue higher formal education, regardless of whether they're single or married. And he added that wives, if they work outside the home, should only be allowed to do practical work and never intellectual work. Is that position justified if we simply preface it with, she has equal dignity? Does equal dignity mean anything in practice? Is it just don't kill and don't chain someone to a radiator? So the first part of today's video will be about what exactly human dignity means. In the second part, I will discuss some studies that will answer the question of what exactly it means that men and women are different, and I'll focus on differences in interest, intelligence, and physical strength. You will be surprised. Theologically, equal dignity of all humans is deduced from the fact that God made men and women in His image and likeness. This ontological human dignity cannot be lost, and it applies to all human beings from conception until natural death. Now, because all humans have equal dignity, they have the right to be treated as humans. This means that human dignity is the foundation of human rights. These rights don't always align with laws in secular law systems, but we'll get to that in a minute. There are somewhat obvious rights, like the right to food, shelter, and the right not to be tortured. But those rights also apply to your dog, if you have one. Because human beings have the unique property of having been created in God's image and likeness, they have unique human rights that go beyond how we treat animals. For example, as Pope Pius XII said in 1942, all humans have the right to maintain and develop their physical, intellectual, and moral life. He also said that intellectually gifted children should be given the opportunity to pursue higher education. In 1963, Pope John XXIII wrote the following: "A system must be devised for affording gifted members of society the opportunity of engaging in more advanced studies with a view to their occupying, as far as possible, positions of responsibility in society in keeping with their natural talent and acquired skill." This is remarkable because, to my knowledge, no secular human rights convention addresses special education for intellectually gifted people explicitly. In secular legal systems, there is usually a general human right to education, so it's fascinating that the Pope listed promotion of intellectual giftedness as a right derived from human dignity, together with basic rights like the right to food. Another human right listed by popes is the right to choose a state of life, so whether to marry, enter a religious order, or become a consecrated virgin. You might object now with Genesis 1:28 or 1 Timothy 2:15, which sound like there is an obligation to reproduce, or at least to marry. To clarify this, I'd like to quote Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who said, "God will ask each person on Judgment Day, 'Where are your children?' Generation there must be, either physical or spiritual. There is a close connection between saving our souls and begetting life. In the spiritual order, St. James tells us that if we save a soul, we save our own." St. Augustine also explains in his Confessions that being fruitful and multiplying can be both physical or spiritual. And St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7:8 that staying unmarried is good. Apart from that, there are the following rights: the right to take an active part in public life, the right to use material goods, the right to work conditions for women that are consistent with their needs and responsibilities as wives and mothers, and the right to private ownership. That was just a selection of rights that I found particularly interesting. Please also keep in mind that in the encyclicals, the word man is used to refer to all humans, both male and female, as becomes clear from the Latin original texts where the word homo is used. It's also important to know that there is no right to sin, as sinning is an act that is contrary to human dignity. Now, you might be wondering what the connection is between secular human rights and the biblical concept of human dignity. To explain this, I'd like to show you a video clip.
You know, the notion that every single human being, regardless of their peculiarities and strangenesses and sins and crimes and all of that, has something divine in them that needs to be regarded with respect and that plays an integral role, at least an analogous role, in the creation of habitable order out of chaos. That's a magnificent, remarkable, crazy idea. And yet, we developed it, and I do firmly believe that it sits at the base of our legal system. I think it is the cornerstone of our legal system.
Made in God's image and likeness, the cornerstone of our legal system. Many secular bodies of law, in particular human rights conventions, either explicitly or implicitly reference human dignity as their foundation. Let me demonstrate the far-reaching and maybe counterintuitive consequences of this by using the seemingly basic right to life. Please keep in mind that I will look at this particular example strictly from a legal perspective, not a moral one. My goal is to demonstrate how the concept of human dignity is applied in legal concepts. You're probably familiar with the trolley problem. The trolley problem is a moral dilemma where you must choose between two actions: diverting a trolley to a track where it will kill one person, or doing nothing and allowing it to kill 5 people on the current track. Are you allowed to divert the trolley? The utilitarian answer would be yes, because you'd have to save the most lives, or those with the greatest combined life expectancy. But the Austrian legal system, my home country, provides a different and fascinating answer to that question. Because of the infinite dignity and infinite value of a human life, you can't just add the lives together. You would not be justified in choosing to divert the trolley because every life has equal value. Infinite value. We've seen in what sense men and women are equal, so let's look at their differences now. Before I summarize some interesting studies, it's necessary to define the terms man and woman now, particularly in our day and age. The definition I will use refers to biological realities, or as Trent Horn phrases it, a woman is a human ordered towards gestation, and a man is a human ordered towards impregnation. In that sense, all men are different from all women. But when it comes to other aspects, like differences in interests, intelligence, and physical strength, it's important to highlight that men and women are often different on average. Let's start with interests. In my last video, I talked about how much more men than women are interested in apologetics. And many of you pointed out that this is because, in general, men are interested in things and women are interested in people. But now let's look at the exact extent of that difference. According to a meta-analysis that looked at multiple studies with a total of more than 500,000 respondents, there is a statistically large difference between men and women when it comes to interest in things versus people. But what exactly does statistically large mean? In the study, they write that the intensities of interest in men and women in those topics are 0.93 standard deviations apart. That's probably too abstract for anyone to know what that means. I couldn't find a graphical illustration of their findings, so I plotted one myself. This is what the difference looks like. As you can see, even though this is considered to be a statistically large difference, there is significant overlap between the curves. What is also important to add is that the graph of a normal distribution, which is what we see here, never touches the x-axis. It only approximates it. So although rare, you will find women at the extreme end of interest in things, and you will find men at the extreme end of interest in people. That means that the difference between members of the same sex can be substantially larger than the average difference between men and women. Now let's look at differences in intelligence, particularly IQ. The scientific consensus is that men and women have the same IQ on average. But what's interesting is that men systematically overestimate their IQ and women systematically underestimate it. Regarding IQ, there is also the hypothesis that men's IQ distribution has a greater variability, which would mean that there are both more male geniuses and more intellectually disabled men. By the way, this distribution doesn't mean that there are no women with an IQ above 140, because as I've explained before, curves of normal distributions never touch the x-axis. So if we take the standard deviations from this particular study, they mean that 0.67% of men and 0.12% of women have an IQ of at least 140. The graphs you see here are the IQ distributions in Germany, but if we generalize that for the entire world, that would mean that about 5 million women worldwide have an IQ of at least 140. Finally, let's look at differences in physical strength. First, it's important to know that men usually have about 10 times more testosterone than women. This is important to consider because testosterone is used as a steroid, so just by looking at testosterone alone, you could say that compared to women, men are basically on steroids. But what does that look like in practice? Interestingly, when you look at world records at the Olympic Games, the difference between men and women in running and swimming events is only 10%. But when it comes to the ability to lift weights, one study found that women's strength in the upper body is usually 52% that of a man, and in the lower body it's usually 66%. I also recommend another source that is not scientifically rigorous, but still helpful for orientation. Here you can look at different lifts and see what is considered strong for each sex and how the sexes compare. Notice that if a guy doesn't lift at all, women in the intermediate category and above will be able to outlift him. And at the elite level, women can become stronger than the majority of men. The reason why I mentioned all of those studies is that now it becomes clear that there is great variability within each sex. So not all women are one way and all men are the other way. And I'd like to point out the harm of forcing people to conform to gender stereotypes. For example, under my last video, a woman commented that she adores theology, but she avoids intellectual discussions with men because many men seem to perceive interest in intellectual discussion as unfeminine. In the same comment section, a man commented that he has never met a woman who wanted to engage in an intellectual discussion. It's really worrying when the pressure to conform to gender stereotypes stops people from developing their talents, sharing their ideas, or following their interests. Jordan Peterson described interest as a way God calls us to certain actions. For me personally, that is the most fascinating statement he ever made.
You have a will and you can exercise a certain amount of conscious control over your being, but there are all sorts of things that occur within you that seem to be beyond your capacity to control. Your dreams, for example, that's a really good example, or your impulses, for example. You might think of those as so foreign from you that you don't even want them to be part of you. But more subtly even, how about what you're interested in, what compels you? Like, where does that come from? Exactly. Because you can't conjure it up of your own accord, you know? So if you're a student and you're taking a difficult course, you might say to yourself, well, I need to sit down and study for 3 hours. But then you sit down and that isn't what happens. Your attention goes everywhere. And you might say, well, whose attention is it then if it goes everywhere? Because you say it's your attention. It's like, well, if it's your attention, maybe you would be able to control it, but you can't. And so then you might think, well, Jen, just exactly what the hell is controlling it? And you might say, well, it's random. Well, it better not be random. I can tell you that. That happens to some degree in schizophrenia. There's an element of randomness in that. It's not random. It's driven by the action of phenomena that I think are best considered as something like subpersonalities, although even that's only a partial description. You can't make yourself interested in something. Interest manifests itself and grips you. That's a whole different thing. And so what is it that's gripping you? And how do you conceptualize that? Is that a divine power? Well, it's divine as far as you're concerned because it grips you and you can't do anything about it. And so there's a calling in you towards what you're compelled by and what you're interested in. And sometimes that might be very dark and sometimes not. But you're compelled forward by your interest. And so the idea that what moves you away from your country and your father's house and the comforts of your childhood home is something that's beyond you and that you listen to and hearken to. That's exactly right. And you can say, well, I don't want to call that God. It's like, it doesn't matter what you call it exactly. It doesn't matter to what it is, what it's called. It still is. And if you don't listen to it, that's the other thing. If you don't listen to it, and I've been a clinician and talked to enough people now, as old as I am, to know this absolutely. If you do not listen to that thing that beckons you forward, you will pay for it like you cannot possibly imagine. You'll have everything that's terrible about life in your life and nothing about it that's good. And worse, you'll know that it was your fault and that you squandered what you could have had.
We also know from the parable of the talents that we're supposed to develop our talents. Of course, humans can act in an unnatural or a dysteleological way, but we have a lot of freedom in our life choices before we get to that boundary. A great example of this is Saint Joan of Arc, who had a very exceptional life. I mean, think of the absurdity of the situation. She was a teenage girl that received visions from God and somehow managed to convince the French army to follow her lead and risk their lives in 13 battles. So whatever way we define a perfect woman, we have to acknowledge that this exceptional path can also lead to perfection. God knew what he was doing when he distributed talents and interests. He orchestrated symphonies with the perfect balance of instruments, each with its own role. Many strings, a couple of woodwinds, brasses, and sometimes, on rare occasions, even a piano. As Lila Rose wrote in her book, our gifts are the weapons needed to change the world. In the book, she describes how to find what you were created to fight for and how to fight for it. I highly recommend watching my video summary where I discuss these ideas further. For example, I talk about how to be fruitful and multiply if you're currently single and hope to get married. And because sometimes people ask, I also addressed my relationship status in that video. After all that we've heard, I'd like to devote some attention to Genesis 2:18. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." The reason why it's necessary to talk about this passage is that a gender role does not become justified if you simply preface it with, "they have equal dignity." As we've seen today, equal dignity actually means something, and there is a way to live out gender roles that violates that dignity. That is not my personal opinion, but corresponds to what Pope Leo XIII wrote in his encyclical Arcanum Divina Sapientia in 1880. The man is the ruler of the family and the head of the woman. But because she is flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, let her be subject and obedient to the man, not as a servant, but as a companion, so that nothing be lacking of honor or dignity in the obedience which she pays. This implies that there is a way to live out gender roles that would violate honor and dignity. The word helper in Genesis 2:18 doesn't mean a personal assistant or servant. The word for helper, which is used in the original Hebrew, is azer, and it's used 21 times in the Bible in total. Of those 21 times, in 16 cases, it refers to God as our helper, and it never refers to people who are inferior. I'd like to quote Archbishop Fulton Sheen again on the matter. The divine creation of the two sexes is here suggested as essential from the point of view of fellowship. A helpmate does not mean servile inferiority, but rather that through differences, like a bow and a violin, they would complement each other. Let's make a conscious effort to appreciate those different contributions. Men often work physically very demanding and even life-threatening jobs. They work longer hours. Sometimes they work jobs they don't like because they know that they have to support their family. They do this because they love their family and want to provide for it. Only women, on the other hand, can bring life into this world, enduring one of the greatest pains humans can experience. They often do emotional labor many men would collapse under. They wake up every night for months to feed their crying baby. They often serve as the backbone of their households, managing schedules, resolving conflicts, and ensuring that everyone feels cared and loved. They do the work that so often goes unnoticed. In conclusion, both partners should help each other by contributing their personal strengths to the relationship. When discussing the different roles in a family, it's important to devote more time to explaining human dignity, because too often the concept is left floating around in the abstract. As we've seen today, equal human dignity has far-reaching practical consequences. Having journeyed through all of those different sources, I'd like to read a passage from the Catechism that summarizes it all. Man and woman were made for each other, not that God left them half-made and incomplete. He created them to be a communion of persons, in which each can be a helpmate to the other, for they are equal as persons, bone of my bones, and complementary as masculine and feminine. This is an immensely important topic, so please share this video with someone you think will benefit from it. That's been it for today. God bless, and bye!